Yeah, I think I need a cowbell. Susie, would you mind passing these out for me? Cheryl Wayne's busy talking. I have a friend named Susie who's here, and she's going to be distributing a little booklet about grief written by two brothers, the Williams brothers, Ron and Don. We want to make sure that every family represented here gets one of these. We are very much into giving information away for folks to take back home for them so that they can use it to educate themselves and help other people. Cheryl Wayne also has some folders, manila folders, that he's going to pass out. Again, more information that you can take home with you. One per family, please. But we want to make sure that we provide information for people to think and study about this privately in their homes. Brother Bill, I met Brother Bill earlier, 93 years old. Nobody claims to be older than him. And so I want to give him a gift. We're going to give him this little booklet here. This booklet is entitled Widowhood, Coping with Life-Changing Loss of a Spouse. What's really, I think, special about this book is this little booklet it's written by Bobby Denton. Bobby Denton is famous in the state of Alabama. He is the longest serving state senator ever in the state of Alabama, and he's a member of the church. He lives in the Florence, Alabama area. Miss Susie, would you pass this on to Bill? Bill, would you raise your hand, please, so Susie knows where she's going? Bobby Denton is a fine Christian man. We recently, Cheryl Wayne and I recently were able to be in his home and visit with him in his home in Florence, Alabama, and I really appreciate him writing some of his thoughts and feelings and experiences after he lost his precious wife. He took her to the hospital for surgery, just a common, ordinary surgery, and he never was able to bring her home. Things happen. Inexplicable things happen. Now, let me ask, in this room right now, what couple here has been married longer than anybody else? I need a couple who's been married longer than anybody else, okay? How many years? 57. Can anybody beat 57? Do I have a 58? 62. I'm just like an auctioneer. 57, 62, 66. That's the name of a route, a famous route. Yeah. Can anybody beat having been married 66 years? Nobody? 66 going once, 66 going twice? Okay, your name? Barbara. Okay, Barbara, I'm going to give you this book. It's called Weekly Joy for Senior Saints. It's a book that is produced and distributed by the Jenkins Institute. Some of you maybe are familiar with our brother who used to be the preacher at Louisville Church of Christ, Jeff Jenkins. He and his brother Dale have this Jenkins Institute ministry, and they have put together this book. It really is a very good devotional book, so please pass that on down. And I would like to make sure I get a picture of the two of you who received those things after this session, if you would allow me that opportunity. I want to give you a real quick introduction to the subject of widowhood generally, and give you a little bit of an explanation about how this ministry got started before we delve into some scriptures. The woman who became my wife was born in 1952 in Northeast Ohio. And when we were 19 years old, we got married. I don't highly recommend getting married at 19 years old, but it worked out for us, but those first few years were extremely difficult from a practical and financial standpoint. And during that time, we were blessed with 3 daughters. Our 3 daughters, one lives in Middle Tennessee, one is in Gainesville, Florida, and the other is outside of Atlanta. They were all raised right. In the lower right-hand corner, their t-shirts say God first, then family, then the Ohio State Buckeyes. I spent the vast majority of my life in the Buckeye State, and that is where they launched their lives. But we're very proud of them. They are faithful Christians and married to good men, and I appreciate their devotion to ministry in their local churches. We were also blessed with 5 grandchildren, and this picture was taken a little over a year after my wife passed away at the place where she's buried in Dover, Ohio. And in regard to counting your blessings, have you ever thanked the Lord for the ability to hug and for somebody to hug? My wife, when she was in the hospital bed at home, when our youngest grandchild at that point, named Brooklyn, was placed in her bed, she couldn't even raise her arms to hug that grandchild of hers. See how many blessings we have that we don't think about? When we think specifically about our blessings, we will really be amazed at how blessed we are. There is a book out there on the table, the display table, called 1,000 Gifts. It's a book written about a lady who's on a journey to count 1,000 blessings in her life. I've had some women tell me it's the best book they've ever read outside the Bible. It really will cause you to become a whole lot more grateful and a whole lot more contented because of your deeper gratitude. She passed away on Christmas morning of 2013 at 9:40 in the morning. She had Parkinson's disease for 8.5 years and deteriorated very fast for a Parkinson's patient. About 3 weeks after my wife passed away, I was sitting in my empty house by myself, and I did something I had never done before and haven't done since, and that is I spoke to myself out loud. Some of you people look like you are talk to yourself kind of people, but I'm not a talk to yourself kind of person. And I was sitting there the middle of January of 2014, and I said out loud spontaneously, it just came out. It was like I had no filter between my brain and my lips, and I said, what's wrong with me? And I was just such a mess. You know, here I'd been a Christian since I was 15 years old, and I'd been to Fried Hardeman as a Bible major, and I'd been a local preacher for years. I'd even taught grief classes. But here I was struggling. I was the one now who was dealing with it personally. And dealing with it personally is different from reading about it in a book. And after struggling the way I was, I did what any sane person does when they want truthful information about anything. I went to the internet. So I started searching for ministries to help widowed people. And you know what I found? Virtually nothing. And I just had a come to Jesus meeting with myself. And I thought, wow. At that point, I'd been with the church there for 32 years. And during that 32-year period, I'd been with the vast majority of those people when they had lost their loved ones, including their spouses. And what I knew for a fact, there was no question in my mind, I knew that loss was an awful thing. What I had no idea about was living with that loss day in and day out for the rest of my life. Because no matter what you do with the rest of your life, that is a part of your life, that loss. And we have to learn to live with that loss and adjust our life and be resilient. And that's a very difficult thing to do. So I came up with this idea of the Widowhood Workshop Ministry. I sold my family on it. My 3 children, my sons-in-law, my 5 grandchildren, they are the Widowhood Workshop Ministry team. Now, a few years ago, we adopted a new family member, Uncle Cheryl, he's called. We've adopted him into the family. They are the workshop team, and we conduct workshops anywhere we can go about grief, about widowhood. We help churches start local widowhood ministries. And what we also do during the year, in the month of July, we host an annual widowhood retreat. Now we have camps for kids. We have youth meetings for kids. And we do family encampments. We have marriage enrichment seminars. Why don't we have something for the widowed? And so this is going to be the 6th year that we've hosted this event, and it's open to any widowed person, male or female, no matter when they lost. And we've had people attend that particular retreat that lost their spouse in their 20s, and we've had people attend that weekend that were in their 90s. Last year we had 111 widowed people there from 15 different states. We already have 80 registered now from 16 different states. We're looking to have somewhere in the neighborhood of 125 this year. And what we do is we provide an opportunity to be encouraged. Because one of the struggles after the loss of your spouse especially is the struggle of the social aspect of who you are as a widowed person in a culture that's coupled. We're going to be talking about life after the loss of your spouse when your spouse has died. Now, we're a minority. We're 6% of the population, those of us who are widowed, but a third of the population over 65 is widowed. If you break that down to male and female, look at how many women there are over 65 years old. Well over a third of the women over 65 years old, over a third of them are widowed, 12% of the men. If you go down to 55, almost a third of the women 55 years and older, and 9% of the men are widowed. Now, what would you guess as the decade where you lose the most spouses? You know, you look at the population generally, what decade of life would you expect an abundance of people to lose their spouse? It wouldn't be in their 20s or 30s, right? What decade would you choose? 60s, 70s, okay. You know, you think about 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, you're going to lose, that's going to be a boatload of people who lose their spouse. Do you know what the average age of a woman is in our country when she's first widowed? It's 57. Now, when you think about the abundance of people in their 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s who lose their spouses, how in the world could you drive that average number down to 57? You'd have to have a boatload of women who lose their spouses a lot earlier. I'll share with you just a few. Buffy is a teacher in Southwest Georgia. Every day at lunchtime, she called her husband and talked to him on the phone. This one day, when she hung up, she was concerned. And she went to her car and started driving home, but it was a 45-minute commute. She called her dad, who was a law enforcement officer, on that 45-minute journey and said, "Dad, go to the house. I'm concerned about him." When her father got to the house, much quicker than she did, the father-in-law found the son-in-law had taken his life. They had a child a little over a year old. We could go to West Tennessee and visit Brittany, who was married for about 1,300 days. I know that because I read her blog after her husband, Bradford, was killed in an automobile accident in West Tennessee, in Trenton, Tennessee. He was a counselor for children, and he was on an assignment that day, was in an awful accident. And here Brittany was in her 20s. She woke up married, and when the sun went down, she was widowed. Cynthia lived not too far from me when I was living in West Tennessee for 5 years after my wife passed away. And Cynthia heard an explosion. Her husband had gone out to the barn to do some welding on a diesel truck where there was a tank on the back that he would use to take and fuel his machinery in the fields. They were big cotton farmers in West Tennessee. And he went out there and did welding on this tank. And this tank that was on the back of this truck had 75% diesel fuel in it and 25% fumes, which is not a problem. But what he did not know was there was a pinhole leak in that tank. And when he cranked up that welder, it exploded. His body was blown out of the building. She ran and got a bunch of comforters, and she got him sopping wet in the bathtub, ran out and threw those comforters on her husband's body. He was life-flighted to Memphis, Tennessee, about 80 miles away. 29 years old, 3 kids, and the cotton in the field is white. It was close to harvest time. There are a lot of people who lose their spouses way before we typically associate the age where you lose your spouse. Anybody who's married is at risk of being widowed, because the only way you can be widowed is to say, I do. I don't say that to create a cloud over the marriage of anybody, but that's just a fact. God doesn't talk to us in the Bible about death to scare us. He tells us about death, and he reminds us about death so that we can live life to its fullest with the greatest meaning and prepare for the inevitable. When we start, we say, until death do us part. But when do we ever reference that? When do we ever think about that? When do we ever discuss that? After the wedding ceremony. You're talking about in the neighborhood of 15 million widowed people in our country. And in the United States, who's ministering to those people? It's not an uncommon thing for over 1 million in a year in our country to lose their spouse, and 6% of those can be under 44 years of age. We need to talk about widowhood to help people prepare for the transition from being married to being widowed. I would not do a wedding ceremony. When I was a local preacher, I just felt so committed to this that I would sometimes lose some friends doing this, but I would not choose to officiate at a wedding ceremony without extensive premarital counseling. And the reason why I believed in premarital counseling is I knew that there was a big transition of going from being single to being married. There's nothing you can do to totally prepare somebody from going single to married. But there are some things you can do to help with that transition from being single to being married. And that's why I always required extensive premarital counseling. Now, if there's any value in premarital counseling to help with that transition, what are we doing to help married people transition from being married to being widowed? What are we doing to help them? And how does a good marriage end? There's only one way. Bad marriages can end in a number of different ugly ways. There's only one way a good marriage ends, and that's with somebody else being left behind. This is an issue that we need to talk about. We need to have studies about in our Bible classes in the local church. 78% of the widowed are women. That's why a lot of the things that you read are written from the female perspective. And that's why the 3 books that I wrote trying to incorporate both the male and the female perspective. Most of the research that's done in regard to widowhood is done focused on the females because they are the majority of the widowed people. In the world, there's 245 million. Now imagine that, 245 million women in our world that are widowed, and 115 million live in abject poverty. The countries of India and China both have over 40 million widowed females. And if you want to read a heart-crushing article about what it's like to be widowed in the country of India, the National Geographic did an article like that. In February of 2017, there's an article here about what it's like to be widowed as a female in India. One of the reasons why I bring that up is, as we do our missionary work in various countries, one of the things that we need to make sure that we require of our missionary efforts is that we develop a church culture there, just like we need to develop a church culture here in regard to caring for people who are widowed. Now, I'm going to open this up for discussion. I'm going to ask you to look at those 3 descriptions of how God refers to himself in regard to the widowed, and I'm going to ask you about what that says about God and the widowed. He says he's a defender, a protector, and a reliever of the widowed. What does that say about him? Anybody? Okay. He wants to take care of them, and he will take care of them. Okay. What else does it say about God and the widowed? Why would he want to take care of them? What motivates, some people take care of other people for money. It's their job. There's love and compassion for the fact that they're living in an unusually difficult life circumstance. God is a God of great love and awesome compassion. We should reflect that in our lives and in our church families. Now, how does God do that? How does he defend, relieve, and protect the widowed? It doesn't say that in those passages, but how does he do that? You think there's anything here that might help along that line? But then, what about people? Who are God's huggers? Who are God's lovers? Who are God's supporters? Who are God's encouragers? We are. We are. If you're old enough to remember this, you're older than dirt. There was a song that used to be sung on occasion, God has no hands but our hands to do his work today. He has no feet but our feet. We're the ones that are being charged with the responsibility to display his love and his compassion in a personal, physical, visible way in the culture that we live in. Have we been doing that? I confess to you, I had not. Psalm 94 verse 6 mentions about the wicked not caring in regard to the widowed. They would even slay the widowed. It wouldn't matter to them. And then one of the things that Job was accused of by his three friends when they opened their big fat mouths and became miserable comforters is they charged him with having sent widows away empty. Again, they thought that, if you're suffering the way you are, Job, then there's some real serious sin in your life. And probably one of the things you've done is you've even sent widows away empty. In Deuteronomy 24, the Israelites are in a critical time in their history where they're getting ready to cross the Jordan River, and they're going to have to go in and take the land of Canaan, and these heathen, barbaric, militaristic kind of people live there. And instead of God emailing Moses a map and strategy that's about military maneuvers in the land of Canaan, he talks to them about something else. He talks to them about people and experiences and relationships. In Deuteronomy 24, starting at verse 17, you shall not pervert justice due to the stranger, the fatherless, nor take a widow's garment for a pledge. There are three life circumstances that are mentioned there: stranger, fatherless, widowed. What do those three have in common? They're different, and yet there's some similarity. Okay, they're alone. What else? Yeah, they're without support. They're in a very difficult, unusually difficult life circumstance. Now, he says, take care of them. And he says in verse 18, but you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore, I command you to do this thing. Now he gives them details. When you reap your harvest in your field and you forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back and get it. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat your olive trees, you shall not go over the boughs again. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. When you gather your grapes of your vineyard, you shall not glean it afterward. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. And you shall remember that you were a slave. This is the second time this is mentioned. And you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore, I command you to do this thing. What's he telling them to do in regard to the foreigner, the widowed, and the fatherless? Take care of them. They may have different circumstances specifically, but they're in uniquely difficult life circumstances. Why should they do that? Well, you remember when you were in Egypt and you were hollering and you were crying out because you were so enslaved. I not only heard you, I responded, and I brought you out of the land of Egypt. If I treated you like that, now you treat other people who are suffering, who are going through a difficult time in their life. You treat them with compassion because I treated you with compassion. And he even says, if you do that, I'll bless you because you blessed others. Now, the sad reality is, we'll not take the time to look at it, but in Isaiah chapter 1, they didn't do it. They didn't listen. They are reproved in Isaiah chapter 1. They become like Sodom and Gomorrah. They become disobedient. They'll offer their sacrifices. They'll observe their festivals. They're offering their tithes. But they were not showing social justice. Social justice as it's described in the Bible through the eyes of God. They weren't taking care of people. And so one of the things that they're challenged to do is wash themselves, clean themselves, and plead for the widowed. Now, some of you are going to think, well, but the circumstance of a widow back then was different than the circumstance now. And you're right. It was. And the circumstance of a fatherless person back then and a foreigner or a stranger was different back then too. We'll talk about that in a minute. Jesus indicted the Jewish leaders as those who would even devour widows' houses, taking advantage of them instead of being a blessing to them. And then in Acts chapter 6, we have this passage that often is looked at only when we're appointing deacons or elders in the Lord's church, because we want those people of leadership to assume those leaderships and make sure that things are done right and the function is decent and in order in the church. But in Acts chapter 6 and verse 1, what was the issue? Widows were being neglected in the daily distribution. I'm going to read to you a part of chapter 6, verse 1. Now, in those days when the number of the disciples was multiplying, I noticed on the board out there, there were a little over 300 people at church here last Sunday. You know what you have when you have 300 people together? You got a lot of problems, a lot of stresses, a lot of burdens. Can you imagine being a member of a church of 20,000? Not 2,000, 20,000? Wayne Jackson, in his commentary on the book of Acts, suggests that probably at this time, as you're reading from chapter 2 to chapter 6, verse 1, and you read about all the adding of the disciples and multiplying of the disciples, he estimates you're probably talking about 20,000 people. Can you imagine being an elder in the Lord's church with 20,000 people? Can you imagine the headaches? Can you imagine the stressors, the difficulties? And these people who were in Jerusalem, how many of them came expecting to stay a long time? They came for the expected time. They were in Jerusalem a lot longer than they anticipated. Have you ever been in that situation where you went somewhere taking enough clothes for 3 days and you end up being there 3 months? You've got some needs, don't you? Now, can you imagine this? Can you imagine the ministry challenges that they would have had in that situation with the church growing so rapidly? All the ministry things that would have had to have been done to help the people in that church family? Now, which one is mentioned in the Bible first? It's the widowed. Of all the ministry weaknesses, and I'll guarantee you they had ministry weaknesses prior to Acts chapter 6, verse 1. When you've got a group of people with that many people, and those people have needs, and they're struggling with their life circumstances, and some of them, imagine the losses that would have been experienced during that period of time, because their life was going on in a fallen world, and bad things were happening. And yet the first ministry weakness in the first century church that's mentioned in the Bible is the neglect of the widowed. In those days, when the number of the disciples was multiplying, there arose a complaint against the Hebrews by the Hellenists because their widows were neglected in the daily distribution. And did God want that to continue? No. Now, I want you to look at this passage, very familiar passage, and I want you to look at this passage and identify the subject in that sentence. Remember English, for some of you this was way back, okay? But, okay, subjects and verbs, and then there are objects of verbs, and there are modifiers, there's adjectives and adverbs. Look for the subject of this sentence. Not the modifiers, just look for the subject. It's only one word. What is it? It's religion. Religion. This verse is about religion. Now, it's not the only verse in the Bible about religion. As a matter of fact, the previous verse, in verse 26, talks about useless or vain religion. But this verse is talking about some sort of religion. Now, the English word religion comes from a Latin word, religere, which means to bind back. It's very similar to the word reconciliation in the Bible, where to be reconciled is to be made friends again with somebody that you've been estranged from, is the idea of reconciliation. So this is about religion. It's about man and God. Okay, but what kind of religion? They're modifiers of the subject. What are the modifiers? Pure and undefiled. Now, what does that tell you about religion? If there's pure and undefiled religion, what does that suggest? What is there also? There is impure and defiled religion. I've got a real blunt message to a world that needs to hear this desperately. All religion is not right in the sight of God, period. That's not a debatable issue. There's wrong religion and there's right religion. Now, which one do you want to practice? This is about pure and undefiled religion. In whose perspective? Look at the verse, look at the sentence. In whose perspective? Okay, not the popes, not the preachers. This is not any council or synod voting about it. This is about pure and undefiled religion in the sight of God, okay? Now, there are three verbs in this sentence. The first one is, and we're going to observe the Passover on that verb to get to the next two verbs. What are the other two verbs in that sentence? Visit and keep. Okay, keep yourself unspotted from the world. Isaiah chapter 6 is a beautiful passage about the holiness of God that gives you a dramatic perspective of, I think, what it's going to very much be like when we're able to enter into heaven. There's going to be a lot of things that you think about now that you're not going to think about there. You're going to be so amazed and so blown away by the majesty and the glory of God and His holiness. There's going to be a lot of things that fade into insignificance. Holy, holy, holy. That's what Isaiah heard. He saw the Lord sitting on the throne. He was blown away by recognizing in a greater way than he'd ever had before the holiness of God. God is holy. We need to be seeking His holiness in our life. So that means we are devoted to keeping ourselves unspotted from the world. That takes a lot of conviction. That takes a lot of passion to keep ourselves unspotted from the world. Now, there's another verb there. What's that other verb? The one before keep. Visit. That word, if you were to look at the Greek word, that word in the English is translated to, and then you saw the Greek word for the word bishop, and then you see the word bishop, you'd think that those words were kind of like cousin terms. They are very similar, because the idea of the word visit here is just the same as the idea of the bishop. A bishop is an overseer, okay? Visit, this word visit in James 1:27 is talking about overseeing, looking over and looking at the needs and circumstances of a situation, and then because of what you become aware of, then you serve them. That's what that word is all about. And it's in the present tense, which hints at the idea of a habit or a practice. And by the way, the same thing is true in regard to the word keep. Keep on keeping yourselves unspotted from the world is the idea. Keep on looking after, looking over, and helping, and then there's an object of that word visit. There's two of them. What's the first one? The orphans or the widows. Now, what have we done in the church to minister to and care for the orphaned? We used to call them orphans' homes. Now they're called more typically children's homes. And by the way, the vast majority of them do not deal with fatherless or orphaned children. They deal with troubled children. That's what they deal with. Kids who come from very dysfunctional families, or kids who may be themselves highly dysfunctional and may have some real serious issues. And so what we do is we have these children's homes. We bring these children into these homes. We try to train them, give them counseling. And in many cases, a lot of these homes, we try to return them to their families, and we work with the whole families because we see these children as at-risk kids. And we want to help them because they are at risk. They need help. And so we have children's homes all over the place. Schultz Lewis in Valparaiso, Indiana, is a children's home. Midwestern Children's Home, north of Cincinnati, Ohio. Potter Children's Home in Bowling Green, Kentucky. Tennessee Children's Home. There's a campus in West Tennessee, East Tennessee, and Middle Tennessee. North Alabama Children's Home. There are children's homes in Texas. There are children's homes in mission spots where we have missionaries working in different countries. Now, what are we doing in regard to ministering to the widowed, who are an object of the same verb? What are we doing to minister to them like we have chosen to minister to children at risk? I never thought much about this until my wife passed away. And I began to struggle with the day in and day out, the day and night struggle of no longer having her in my life. And I began to learn from experience and then began to read with an insatiable appetite books written by people who had lost their spouses. And I became more familiar with this, and I thought, why in the world had I never ever thought of starting this ministry a lot earlier? Why had we never had, in that church that I'd been with for 33 years, why had we never developed a ministry like this to minister to the widowed? I didn't know what they were going through. That was my problem. My problem wasn't I didn't care. I cared about them because I knew they had suffered loss, and loss is a horrible thing. But you know what's more difficult than loss? Living with that. And your thoughts and feelings and your circumstances after that. That's the greater challenge. Loss is awful. Living with it is the bigger challenge because that's the day in, day out experience. Much more challenging. The reality is we do need to provide assistance, but sometimes we don't know what that is. In 1 Timothy chapter 5, there's a passage written that's basically explaining to families that this is first and foremost, not exclusively, but first and foremost, a responsibility of the family. So my dad passes away. But before he passes away, I promised him, Dad, I'll make sure that Mom's taken care of if something happens to you because of this surgery. Well, he ended up dying, and she was widowed for about 14 years, which, by the way, is about the average length of time that a woman is widowed in our country after the death of her spouse. 14 years is the average. So I was going to take care of Mom. So every week, during lawn mowing season, I drove to the house about an hour away, and I mowed the lawn, and she had the best looking lawn in her neighborhood. I was really proud of that because I'm a control freak, and I'm a recovering control freak and borderline OCD. So the lawn looked really good, and I was very proud of that. I was taking care of Mom. There's balancing of the checkbooks issues occasionally, and then times when somebody needed to be with her with the doctor and those kinds of things. And then we're sitting in her private room in the rehab unit that she was in because she had to have an orthopedic surgery. I'm the second of 4 boys. And so we're sitting in the room, and there's silence. I want you to listen to this silence. And then she says, I wish I would have had a daughter. And I thought, where did that come from? And I had a tendency to be impulsive in speech. That particular time, God gifted me with self-control, and I didn't say a word. And there was more silence because I didn't know how to respond to that. I was shocked by her saying that. And then after a moment of silence, I had a streak of brilliance. This does not happen to me very often in my life. But every once in a while, I had these brilliant streaks. And I said, Mom, I wished you would have had a daughter too. For a lot of years, honestly, in my life, for a lot of years, I felt like I'd been cheated because I had stupid brothers and I didn't have one single sister. I thought it'd be great to have a sister. But then it dawned on me, after decades of thinking negatively like that, I thought I've got a whole church full of sisters. And I didn't have to go through puberty with them. This is awesome. I love this. But, reflecting on what Mom said, I came to realize that you women are the better gender. I say, is this being taped, by the way? Women are the better gender in many, many respects. You are gifted by God to be really great at relationships. You know about nurturing and you know how to cultivate relationships. You get a bunch of women together and I'll guarantee you what they talk about. They talk about people. If they're married, they talk about their husband probably. But women will talk about people and experiences. You get a bunch of men together, you know what they're going to talk about? They're going to talk about their job. They're going to talk about an achievement. Women talk about relationships and people. You women are just really good and gifted in that regard. Men can be good at that kind of thing, but we've got to really work on it. We've got to learn about it, be willing, humble enough to recognize our need and learn about it and become better at it. Well, I've come to appreciate that more and more now, and I understand what Mom was saying. Because you know what she needed more than, I could have hired a teenager to have done that lawn for $20 a week. Now, he wouldn't have done it near as good as I did it, okay? But I could have spent more time with Mom. I did not realize about that kind of need until after I was sitting in a house, empty. And I was going out in public by myself and struggling with the social awkwardness that goes with being widowed, especially the first several years after the loss of your spouse. I didn't understand all of that. But do our families understand what it's like to be widowed? Here's another reason why we need to study about this in our local churches. Do our families know what their widowed parents and grandparents need? I didn't. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 3 starting says, honor widows who are really widows. Now that's kind of insulting if you just read that one verse. Honor widows who are really widows, but if any widow has children or grandchildren, see the distinction? The but here is between really widows and widows who have children and grandchildren. It says, but if any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety at home, to repay their parents, for this is good and acceptable before God. Now you are naive if you think in Christian families that's always done. You are naive if you think that way. I can put you in direct contact with widowed people who are neglected by their own families. You can talk to them personally if you'd like. Then in verse 16, this is the longest passage I know of in the Bible about widowhood. Verse 16 says, if any believing man or woman has widows, let them relieve them, and do not let the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are really widows. W. Vine suggests that there may be an intimation here in this passage that what was happening in the first century church is families were kind of shoving off their responsibility on the church in regard to their parents and their grandparents who were widowed. And Paul is correcting that. Now, in this passage, in verse 8, is right smack dab in the middle of this section of Scripture. I quoted this passage many times out of context, not appreciating what it was really all about. Verse 8 says, but if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially those of his house, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. I would quote that verse to basically teach men to quit being so lazy, get a job and support their families. And that's a secondary application that certainly is worthy. But that's not what the direct context is talking about. The verses prior to verse 8 and the verses after verse 8 are talking about the widowed parents and grandparents in a family. But if anyone does not provide for his own what? And especially those of his own household. His own household, who in his own household? His widowed parents and his widowed grandparents. We need to teach our families about what it's like to be widowed so that they can effectively minister to their widowed parents and grandparents. I did not know what my mother was going through every day and every night. I did not realize the deafening impact of silence in a house. When you're used to some noise. As a matter of fact, do you know what a lot of widowed people do first thing in the morning? Turn on the TV or turn on the radio, get some sort of sound in the house because the silence is deafening. Now, I realize that in our culture, we have a transient culture nowadays. And we may not be in direct location where our parents or grandparents are who are widowed. But that doesn't change the responsibility. There are creative ways that you can make things happen. As a matter of fact, I know of somebody who lives over 1,000 miles away from her widowed mother. And there's a security system in that house where she can see that mother. And she talks to that mother multiple times during the day, especially when it's time to take medication. When there are issues of a financial nature, they get taken care of. There have to be visits during the year. There are creative ways of investing in the lives of our parents and grandparents after they've lost their spouse. We need to make it happen. Just because we live a distance from that parent or grandparent doesn't change the responsibility. So what are we doing relative to ministering to the widowed? I think in a lot of places we could do a whole lot more than we are. A lot of things and people have been canceled, but Dr. Seuss has not been canceled by the Widowhood Workshop Ministry, and I think it's right. This realization, unless someone cares a whole awful lot, just like me and just like you, nothing is going to get better. It's not. By the way, in Wylie, Texas, I've done some research about Wylie, Texas, and about the population. Population 55,426, 17,000, almost 18,000 households. If you were to take all the females 15 years and older, now I don't know why the U.S. Census Bureau considers a 15-year-old an adult, but they do. If you were to take all the females 15 years and older in Wylie, Texas, now not outside the city limits, I'm talking about in the city limits. If you were to take all the females in Wylie, Texas, 15 years and older, 1,000 plus of them would be widowed. 1,000 plus. When you look at both the male and the female, you're talking about well over 1,000 widowed males and females in Wylie, Texas. There's a website you can go to called censusreporter.org, and you can find out all kinds of interesting information about where you live. And one of the things you can find out is how many adults 15 years and older are divorced, male and female, how many are widowed, male and female, how many are married, male and female, and you can find out all kinds of interesting information about the culture that you live in. And I just wonder in Wylie, Texas, could this become the church in the city that's known as the church that ministers to the widowed like nobody else? Well, what an attractive feature that is in a hurting community where there are a lot of widowed people. And then when you stop to think about all the married people who are going to be headed, one of the two of them going to be headed for this experience, what a great opportunity to prepare them for the experience. Well, we're going to go ahead and finish up this session, and let's take another 10-minute break. And this third session is what I would consider the most important of any of the sessions because it gives you a personal perspective about what it's like to be widowed. I wished I would have known this before my father died. I wished I would have known this when I was in my 20s and 30s and preaching for churches where we had widowed people. I would have been a different brother in the Lord. I would have been a much better preacher in a local church. So Please stick around. Let's take about a 10-minute break.